Over the last few videos, we've looked at creating a challenge in pseudocode and converting that to Python, Visual Basic and C#. And that's been aimed more at GCSE level. In this video and the following videos, we're going to increase the complexity and look at more A-level contents. Specifically, we're looking at the OCR A-level specification, which, unlike some of the others, does include a requirement to understand HTML, CSS, both inline and as a separate file, and JavaScript. Let's just take a moment to have a look at the specification. So the specification requires that we understand the HTML tag, a head tag. I'm not sure why they put link before head, but the link to a CSS file, the title, the body, a header 1, 2 and 3, image, anchor tag, a div, form input, a paragraph tag, a list with either a bullet point or an ordered list. You're required to understand about taking CSS for an actual element, for a class, or with an ID. And these are the properties that you need to be aware of: background color, border, the text color, the font family size, and height and width. Now you'll see here it's very clear that it says learners are expected to be able to follow and write basic JavaScript. They will not be expected to commit exact details of text to memory. However, learners will be expected to be familiar with the JavaScript equivalents of the structures listed in the pseudocode section, with the exception of input and output, or object-oriented programming, or file handling. It talks about how you can do an input and how the different types of outputs. We're going to be concentrating on these two. So looking at this, I've put together a challenger. We're going to do this in 3 parts. The last part will be where we take the pseudocode and convert that to JavaScript. The first part, we're going to simply create some HTML and CSS to display a heading, some text, a red square with a particular size, and a button with the text random color. In the second video, we're going to update that so that when we click on the button, it simply sets the color of the square to blue. So just changes it from red to blue and then displays the color of that square below the button. So there's an output and there's an input. This is not standard code, and so in the JavaScript file that I've put together, when we come to that, you'll notice that I have provided the code as the specification says it will be provided. Like I said, the third part will be going through the pseudocode that we wrote in the beginning, or its conversion to JavaScript. So let's have a look at this. So I've created an index.html file, and other than this comment, it's empty. I've created the main.js, which I referred to, and a style.css. And the reason I've called it style CSS will become apparent later. So let's just go back. Now, we do need to be able to understand each of those HTML elements, but especially at A level, we need to be able to understand what are the benefits of an IDE. That's a very common question. And of course, you might talk about IntelliSense, auto-completion, debugging, all types of things like that, but we can also get macros. So for example, when I wish to create a boilerplate starting point for my HTML, I'm using Visual Studio Code here, and I can simply press the exclamation mark and tab, and we actually get a boilerplate to start with. And that's important so you can understand these type of things that can happen. But because this is an A-level project, I'm going to remove most of those and start from scratch. So the first thing we need to do is declare a HTML And again, we are in Visual Studio, so this nicely generates the closing tag for us. Don't forget to do that if you're using a different type of IDE. Then we need to have a head, and inside that head we're going to have a title, and we're just going to call that random color generator. Now remember, this is the title that is displayed in the browser tab. Forgive my spelling here, not in the actual body of the text, because anything that's shown on the screen is shown inside the body. So we need to also be able to include a CSS file, and we want to include the style.css. So we need to do again, using our macros, I can do that just like that, and you'll notice that it automatically calls it style.css, and that's why I did that. Now I'm not going to retype that out, but you can see it is link. We need to put the rel equals style sheet in there because it's a style sheet. Its href is where the name of the file is, and it's in the same folder, so we don't need to worry about forward slashes, and it's called style.css. So that takes us to the first part. So what do we need next? We need a heading called random color generator. We can choose a heading. We remember from the specification H1, H2 or H3. Well, technically this is the only one on the page, so it should be a H1, and I'm going to put that in here. Then we need some text. Well, to display text we would use a paragraph. There are other ways, but this is effectively a paragraph of text, so I'm going to paste that in here. We then need a red square, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but we then need a button below the square with the text random color. Going back to here, we can see that in terms of the submit button, we can use input where it says type equals submit, because there's a submit button. So using that, we can say input type is equal to submit, and its value is equal to, and it says that we need to call that random color. Now this is one of those that is a self-closing element, and I'm going to come back to the red square in a moment. For a moment I'm going to save that. Now again, we're in Visual Studio, and one of the nice things about that, it has a plugin called Live Server, and so if I click now on Live Server, I'm just going to move that over to here, and essentially we can now see, and the beauty of Live Server is that if I change this now to random color 1 and save it, you can see that it automatically updates that for us. And so we have a title, some text, and a button. Does nothing, of course, when we click on it. Now we need to have a red square, and the easiest way to do that is to use a div, and we're not going to put anything in the div, we're simply going to use styling to do that. But in order to style it, of course, in this particular case it's the only div, but I'm just going to give it an ID of square, and while I'm at it, I'm also going to give the submit button an ID of btn submit, or button submit. Of course, you'll see it looks absolutely no different when I save that. So how can we modify this square? So first of all, we need to remember that if we were just using div, we wouldn't need to put anything before the div. If we're using a class, which we're not in this case, we'll put a dot, and then for a ID we use a hash. So we're setting the hash, and the specification said it needed to have a width of 150 pixels, and it needed to have a height of 150 pixels, and it said a background color of red, and the specification states that you need to understand both named colours, which is this, or hexadecimal colours. So remember that red is FF for full red, no green, no blue, and so you need to be able to understand, remember that this is a string, so it's inside quotation, whereas we can simply just put red as a named colour. Now if I save that, you'll see that we now have a red random, sorry, we don't have a random colour, we simply have a red square on the screen. So going back to our part 1, we can see that we've created some markup, we've added a header, we've added some text, we've created a red square, and we have put a random colour or a button with random colour. And so that's the HTML CSS part of that. You need to be able to do something as simple as this at A level for OCR.